Rirastu. Welcome to today's installment of the Goodman Lectures. This series honors the legacy of Professor Stephen D. Goodman, an accomplished Buddhist scholar and a long-term friend of Khyentse Foundation. My name is Dharmamitra Garba. I will be today's host. I'm a student of Buddhism and Sanskrit, and thus I am very interested to learn from Professor Sebastian Nehrdich from Tohoku University in Sendai, who is going to speak about Buddhist philology and AI. Professor Nehrdich has been a leading figure in the development of some of the most widely used and, I would say, reliable tools for Buddhist textual studies available online. And his work is very much appreciated by a number of philologists who focus on Buddhist textual studies in Sanskrit, Tibetan, Pali, and other languages. So we are very happy today to be able to hear about how AI relates to Buddhist philology from someone who I think we can call one of the leading authorities in the field. So thank you very much for being with us. And now I leave it to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the kind introduction. And I am very happy to be invited to this lecture series. It's a great honor for me. And yeah, also my special gratitude to the Khyentse Foundation, who has been supporting my work for several years now in various projects. So that's fantastic. Yeah. Okay, let me start to share my slides. So the topic of my presentation is the relationship of Buddhist philology and AI. And in that regard, I'm presenting on behalf of the Dharmamitra project, of course, which has been my main project for the last 2.5 years. And this project has been significantly supported by the Tzadar Foundation, which I would also like to express my strong gratitude here at this point. Then also, of course, the Tohoku University, which hosts me, and then the Berkeley AI Research Lab, and especially Professor Kurt Kreutzer, who has been giving resources and environment and guidance on the development of the Dharmamitra project for the last 2.5 years. So my talk will be structured into the following 3 different sections. So first, I will give a short introduction of the history of LLMs and what we now call AI and Buddhist studies, and how the interplay of these 2 sections has played out over the last 3 years. Then I will give some more technical and also general observations on the relationship between language modeling and philology. And in the 3rd section, I will talk about Dharmamitra and the Dharma Nexus database and how these tools, what they actually provide for Buddhist studies, and yeah, what capabilities based on the AI technology they bring to the users. Before I go into the actual presentation, I would like to make some preliminary remarks. So on the one hand, in this presentation, if I'm talking about AI, I'm talking about text-oriented applications that are advanced by what we now call large language models, or shortly abbreviated with LLMs. And these are applications like ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude, and so on. But of course, the term AI is much older than that, and this also includes applications like optical character recognition, OCR, handwritten text recognition, image layout, and then we also have natural language processing tasks like neural network-based dependency parsing, part of speech tagging, word segmentation, and so on. So all of these applications can also be called AI, and they are also part of the larger field. But yeah, in this presentation, I will be using the term AI specifically to refer to applications like ChatGPT. On the technical level, these other applications like part of speech tagging, dependency parsing based on neural networks, they can function very, very similarly. So the base technology is often the same. It's just a different scale of the application, a different size that makes the difference. Yeah. But yeah, in this talk, I will limit my focus to the commercial LLMs, yeah, like ChatGPT, and of course our own application Dharmamitra, which I have some knowledge to talk about. Of course, there are also other applications in the field of Buddhist studies who use some sort of AI technology, who use transformers and so on. But of course, I'm not really able to speak on behalf of other teams here. So that's why I'm limiting my talk to Dharmamitra and yeah, commercial LLMs. So if we come to the brief history of AI and Buddhist studies. So on the one hand, if we give historical overviews in Buddhist studies, usually we are more accustomed to give time frames of decades, maybe centuries. In this case, we are talking about a very, very short history that actually only started less than 3 years ago with the appearance of ChatGPT in November 2022. And I think it's fair to say that this was a watershed moment because suddenly we had easily accessible LLMs where you could just go to a website and you could start immediately to chat with these systems, which were able to create fluent text on any kind of input. And even, of course, we all know that it was suddenly able to create requests that didn't make much sense, like to turn the manual of a TV into a web song, but this was suddenly possible. And I think it was certainly a big surprise and something that really changed how we interact with computers today. Then we had the appearance of GPT-4 in March 2023, and this was about the time when I moved to Berkeley to work in the Berkeley AI Research Lab. And GPT-4 has really changed the quality situation of these LLMs very, very significantly. So suddenly GPT-4 was the first model that was really, really good at translating Buddhist Chinese into English. And that was a big surprise at that moment, where so far there was the perception, okay, ChatGPT is an interesting application, but the field of Buddhist studies will not be affected by that because it's just not good at Sanskrit or Tibetan or Buddhist Chinese. But GPT-4, at least when it came to Chinese, really started to change the situation. So, and also, of course, for a lot of people who are doing research in digital humanities and in computer science, in natural language processing, kind of the field that I'm also working in, this was a big shock because suddenly we saw that big, large companies with lots of resources could create applications that are better than what specialized teams who are working on these problems for many years might come up with. Yeah? So that's another dimension of GPT-4 that was really a big change in the field at that time, where many people realized that it might not make so much sense to work on a specific dependency parser anymore if GPT-4 is able to do the same task with higher quality. Then moving forward from there, we had the collaboration between Mönlam AI and Dharmamitra, and we released the first widely accessible machine translation system for Tibetan and English in October 2023, or maybe it was the beginning of November, end of October, beginning of November, on the mönlam.ai website. And I think this is noteworthy because it was one of the first of these generative AI applications that were seeing some adaptation in Buddhist studies. And people started to use this and they found some useful help by using the Mönlam AI machine translation system. And then we saw another big moment, which was the appearance of Claude 3 and 3.5 in the first half of 2024. And this was, I think, maybe the first LLM that was really widely adapted in Buddhist studies, where people suddenly started to use this for not just translating Tibetan or Sanskrit into English, which Claude is very good at, but also to ask general questions, because Claude was able to give answers in Tibetan to a question that was prompted in Tibetan. And I think that was the first model that was really convincingly doing that. And I could see a lot of people in the Tibetan community being very, very excited about this. And I think also in the larger field of Buddhist studies, I have also seen people who have years of experience reading Sanskrit being suddenly very, very amazed by the ability of Claude to give additional explanations on grammatical points and so on. So that was another I think, very important moment for the field. Then moving forward, in 2025, we saw Gemini showing up, which in some ways is an improvement over Claude. It has also very good vision capabilities when it comes to turning, for example, images into text or reading inscriptions, those kind of things. We have seen very, very interesting results using Gemini for that. And then, of course, Dharmamitra as an application is constantly evolving, and we have a growing user base, and we also offer more and more capabilities on our website that are tuned to the needs of people working with textual material in Buddhist studies. And I will talk more about that on later slides in this presentation. I think it's safe to say that by the summer of 2025, AI in the form of LLMs is used across all layers of Buddhist studies. And judging from the feedback we get, the emails that reach us, and also the conversations I had, for example, at the IAPS conference in Leipzig this summer, there are, of course, young students which are still early in their training who are very happy to have these aids like Dharmamitra, but also ChatGPT and so on. And there are, of course, implications on the whole way we teach language, how education happen. And I'm also very aware that this is certainly not all good, and there are big dangers and challenges ahead when it comes to integrating this technology in a mindful way into our field. But then we also get feedback from very experienced senior scholars, people who are decades into their studies of Buddhist material, who still find these tools extremely helpful and useful. So I think it's really by now safe to say we are not so much debating anymore whether people will make use of this, but it's by now, I think, safe to say that people are making use of it. And then the question is more on how can we guide people, and how can we make these applications more useful and reliable for our field. If we look at this from a timeline perspective, here I'm giving two timelines, one for the development of the commercial LLMs and on the bottom line for the Dharmamitra project. So we have ChatGPT in late 2022, which kind of started the official ways for the general chat applications. And then we have a couple of months later, we have GPT-4 showing up. And then for a couple of months, not all too much was happening, but we had the Dharmamitra machine translation system in late 2023 showing up. And then in the beginning of 2024, we see much more happening around the release of the Claude models and also GPT-4o and so on. There was certainly a movement in the field again. Also, 2024 was a very active year for Dharmamitra, so we have released our multilingual machine translation model, the first version of that in around April 2024. This was based on the Google model MATLAB 400. And then a little bit later, we trained our own model on the Gemma 2 foundation by Google again, which we released on our website in August 2025, 24, I mean. And then we also, around that time, we released our own Sanskrit grammatical model, which until today is used on our website, which gives the grammatical breakdown of Sanskrit text pieces, and which has seen a lot of adaptation among people who use Dharmamitra for Sanskrit translation, because it gives the breakdown of individual words, the word segmentation, and so on. Then in the beginning of 2025, we see again quite a lot of movement in the field of the commercial models with Gemini 2, ChatGPT o3, Gemini 2.5, Claude 4, and I think now we have Claude 4.5 since a couple of days, and then we have GPT-5 since a couple of weeks. And at this point, I must admit, the situation is getting rather convoluted, and we have a lot of models that are available. I think ChatGPT was maybe the most striking example. They had a very, very confusing set of o3 mini and ChatGPT 4o, and then o3, and then all these different versions of the model on their website, where even I was struggling to pick the right one for my work. And I think that also is, in a way, it's a symptom of the whole field, where we see all of these like reasoning capabilities emerging in those models, but it also feels like it's the technical progress is a little bit plateauing out, and we see many variations of the same models popping up, and it becomes difficult to understand what the actual benefits are by this point. On the Dharmamitra end, we have released our Gemma 2 embedding model, which I will demonstrate a bit later, which role that plays in our tools in the beginning of 2025. And following that, based on this model, we made available a set of new tools. On the one end, it's the Mitra search application, which enables to search across all of the 4 main languages of the textual tradition, Pali, Sanskrit, Tibetan, and Chinese. Then we have the deep research translation model, which enables not just the translation of text into English, but also the addition of references to the relevant related textual passages and so on. And then we have also the release of Dharma Nexus, which is our textual reference database. So that uses the intertextuality abilities of Buddha Nexus and integrates them into the Dharmamitra system. So to summarize what I have been presenting before, I think in my opinion, the big breakthroughs when it comes to Asian languages and also ancient classical Asian languages like Sanskrit, Tibetan, Chinese, and Pali have largely happened in 2023 and 2024. In general, the AI industry is recently heavily pivoting towards so-called reasoning models. So these are models that are especially good at solving more STEM-oriented problems like mathematical questions and things that can be verified in a more automatized way. But we also see that the ability of these reasoning models on purely language-centric tasks is plateauing and maybe even decreasing. So one feedback that we have been hearing from various sources is that, for example, Claude, which used to be perhaps the best model for translating Tibetan or Sanskrit into English in 2024, by now is actually decreasing in quality. And the latest releases of Claude 4.1 and 4.5 are actually steps back in quality compared to 3.5 1 year ago. And this is maybe not entirely surprising, because these companies like Anthropic, who is behind Claude, or also OpenAI, which is behind ChatGPT, they don't employ people who take care of the quality of these systems for Sanskrit or for Tibetan. So they don't have anybody to monitor what is happening. And if they are improving the quality on mathematical problems or programming problems, it might very well happen that they are actually decreasing the quality for Sanskrit or for Tibetan, because they have no methods to evaluate it to that extent. And that is something we are seeing at the moment. I think we really see that on the one hand, the past progress that happened 2023 and 24 is not to the same degree continuing in our domains of the classical Asian languages. Then what we also see is that all of these large AI systems are increasingly integrating external data resources in order to reduce hallucinations. And I will talk about hallucinations a bit later in my talk. So the startup Perplexity was the first to introduce this, but currently you will see this with all the major AI systems like Gemini, ChatGPT, and so on, that they integrate web search, they can provide links to internet search results into their set of capabilities. And this has certainly helped a lot to reduce the amount of faulty responses and hallucinations and so on in the output of these models. Dharmamitra is also following this approach. So we have the newly introduced capabilities of deep research translation, of Mitra search, and of Dharma Nexus. And the whole aim that we are following with this is to link the capabilities of Dharmamitra with actual textual data that is preserved in our databases, so that we don't just provide a translation, but we can also point the users to possible references and other material that they can then explore in order to understand the context and how the Dharmamitra system is actually arriving at those translations. So this is the first part of my presentation. I'm now moving on to the part on language modeling and philology. So now we have probably most of the people here on this presentation have interacted with these language models in one way or the other. And frequently I get also asked, like, how do these systems actually work? And the answer to that is not that easy. And I think a lot of people even working on this technology are a bit overwhelmed with giving an easily understandable reply. But I will nonetheless at least introduce some of the principles here. So in a way, the term language model in 2025, if we talk about that, generally refers to transformer-based pre-trained language models. And what is this so-called transformer? And transformers are basically like machines that consist of multi-head self-attention, positional encoding, encoder, decoder stacks, and so on. And if that sounds complicated to you, I can assure you it is complicated. Here on the right-hand side is just a diagram from the original transformer paper in 2017 that demonstrates the technical layout of this system. And I think it's safe to say these are complicated systems, and even a lot of people who work with them, who train them, who create these LLM applications are not always able to explain all of these components in detail, because it's just a lot of different elements that come together in a certain way that works. And in that way, I think it's safe to say that transformers are comparable to technology like, for example, jet engines. So we see planes flying around with these engines all over the world every day, yet there are only a few companies who are really able to build reliable jet engines, and usually they have the same principle, but the size and the power and so on, the fuel consumption can differ. And that's a bit how I see transformers in the context of AI technology as well. So they are the main building block and they are extremely important. But we only see a few companies like OpenAI, Google, Anthropic, and others who are able to create this kind of tools and who are able to train these models. So how are these LLMs actually trained? So on the one hand, we have two main training systems. So the one is the so-called masked token prediction. So token here basically is similar to a word, we can say. And the task here is to predict a randomly masked section of text given the context. So we can have a phrase, for example, the Sanskrit phrase Atmadamo pachado hi vivido ya pravatate of the Trimshika as one example. And in order to do this so-called masked token prediction, we will then randomly choose one word in this phrase, for example, vivido in this case, and we will hide it. And then the model has to learn to fill in this gap. So the model gets the task, okay, I need to, given what is written left of the gap, in this case, Atmadamo pachado, he, and right of the gap, ya pravatate, the model then has to fill in the gap and supply vivido as the missing word. So that is one way of training these LLMs. And the other way is the so-called next token or next word prediction, where we start with a phrase and then we predict the tokens in a sequential order going from left to right. So in this case, we start with Atmadamo pachado, and then we predict he, and then based on the two words, we predict the next word. We go to vivido, then we go to ya, then we go to pravatate. So it's a sequential prediction task, and the model is basically learning one token at a time to generate this output. And this is also why you will see, if you use tools like ChatGPT and Claude, how they generate one token after the other. And you can actually see that visually on the website, where the output is coming in a stream and it's generated one token at a time. So in order to summarize the basic principle of these pre-training systems, so these models are basically learning to reconstruct gaps in a piece of text by purposefully limiting the access to information during training. So we are purposefully hiding parts of the text, and then the model learns to fill in these gaps. And in that way, this is a little bit like a compression approach, where we have a larger data set and we use a smaller model in order to represent that larger data set. And what happens if we do that is the smaller model learns the underlying mechanisms and the underlying rules of the language. So it starts to acquire abilities to generalize on grammatical and syntactic characteristics of the language. And I think this is in certain ways not unlike the work of philologists. So when philologists are confronted with knowledge gaps like unclear manuscript passages, possible variant readings, and so on, the task of a philologist then becomes to identify the most probable solution given all the available information. And in general, the interesting questions are, of course, those where some information got lost, yeah, because there is something unclear in a manuscript or something happened in the text that on the first look is difficult to understand. And if we think about this, I would like to demonstrate one manuscript that I've been working on in the past, the Madhyanta Vibhagatika, which was burned badly on one side, and about 30% of each of the folios got lost. And this means that basically on every line we have this gap of about 30%. And then the task of the philologist in this case is to reconstruct what has been lost when the manuscript got damaged. And on that end, of course, we have a good Tibetan translation, which is extremely helpful for this task. But still, the gaps need to be filled in based on the knowledge of Sanskrit. And in that case, I think it's very reasonable to say that the task the philologist is confronted with, and if we go back the task the language model, what we see here is confronted with to reconstruct this gap given a piece of text, are actually very similar. So in that way, the way we are training these LLMs and the way people are dealing with philological problems when it comes to working with textual material are in certain ways similar. And on this end, I would also like to briefly talk about hallucinations, because they are another problem that is frequently encountered with this technology. And I think also just by the architecture of these models and how they function, very, very difficult to avoid in principle. So as we have seen before, models are trained on gaps in data. They learn to reconstruct these gaps, and when they are generating the text, they are choosing the words to fill in those gaps based on their statistical probability. And if we are confronting the model with some problem that it has not seen in the previous training data, or the training data might be ambiguous, and I think on a lot of cases you can imagine, for example, the date of a figure like Vasubandhu, we might have 5 to 10 different opinions in the available literature of Buddhist studies, and in that way, how can the model actually learn to provide one solution to a problem where we might have 5 to 10 different valid solutions, or at least valid opinions in our field? And this is exactly the problem. If we face a model with such kind of data, it will start to learn solutions that are statistically possible, but very likely factually not correct, because it cannot really decide on how to go forward. And in that sense, if we stick to that example, when did Vasubandhu live? an LLM can actually answer in different ways. It might say Vasubandhu lived in the 1st century, maybe in the 4th century, maybe in the 12th century. And on that end, I didn't really check recently what the main LLMs are answering to these questions, but I hope they give by now reasonable answers. But if you would have entered this question to the 1st generation of ChatGPT, you will very likely get very confusing results. I think in 2022, there was certainly not any useful response to be expected. And I think nowadays we might still encounter these problems, especially if we look at figures that are less, let's say, mainstream in the research literature, who have been only mentioned a few times in existing books. There's a very high chance that the LLMs will produce unreliable answers for that. While I hope that for a figure like Vasubandhu, by now we should have reliable answers. However, you can think about this problem also from the point of view of the LLM. So if you give an input and you ask, when did Vasubandhu live? Then statistically, the LLM is likely to say, well, Vasubandhu lived in the 12th century is still a better answer than to answer, well, no, he didn't live at all, because asking a question, when did Vasubandhu live, actually implies a positive answer already. And in that way, that is why LLMs behave the way they behave, because the way they are prompted also sets a certain stage of expectation. And of course, humans who have concrete knowledge on the facts of a certain situation, they are able to say, no, 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 that question is phrased wrongly. But LLMs in general are very weak on doing that. So they need to have external databases and so on to be able to do that. And on this note, I think it's also important to remember that humans have this problem of hallucination as well. And if I was to give this presentation without my slides, without any notes, just completely on my own, I will be also quite likely to get some of the details wrong. I might pick the wrong date for the release of ChatGPT, for example. Those kind of things happen if we rely entirely on our own memory and we are not very trained, like I am, for example, in memorizing things. Then there's a very high chance that I will produce unreliable output. But LLMs on that end are just not able to critically examine their own output. So where does this leave us if we think about the impact of LLM technology on philology? So what are the actual differences between these tools if we want to compare humans and LLMs, which is of course a dangerous comparison. But I think still nonetheless there can be some general observations. And I think on the one hand, humans are just limited in the amount of data they can process. So we have only so much time in a lifetime. We can read books, but at some point we run out of time. And LLMs, on the other hand, have access to trillions of words, and the training can be done in a couple of months. So this basically gives the LLM an almost unlimited access to knowledge that is encoded in textual form. Now, one advantage of humans is that humans can learn complex things from rather little data. So for example, a human can buy a textbook on Japanese and study a couple of months, maybe years of Japanese, and then learn the language, basically based on one or two or a couple of books, while an LLM would need millions of pages of text to really get fluent in Japanese. So that's a huge difference. So LLMs always require these large data sets in order to reach good performance. Then humans have the ability to think and reason into problems, and they can judge the quality and their own confidence in the answer. So if we don't know something, we might say, okay, I'm not confident to answer that. While in the case of LLMs, all these claims around their reasoning capabilities are actually still highly contested, and it's an open, ongoing dispute in the research if LLMs are actually able to reason or not. And they are very likely to give answers confidently without the ability to test for reliability. Even though we are seeing improvements on that end, I think GPT-5, Gemini 2.5 and so on, they are more likely to refuse to answer if they are not, if the question is not really represented in their database. But this is an ongoing battle, and we are still seeing these weird hallucinations and unreliable outputs in these models happening again and again. And then the last point that I want to make is that humans are able to combine data from all kinds of sources. So we have eyes, we have ears, we can read, we can listen, we have a strong idea of the physical world. We can judge distances and so on. And this is, of course, also extremely important when working with manuscripts and with textual material, because in many cases we have to think beyond the literal words that are printed. It's more about thinking about, could this have been an iScript, for example, if the author suddenly breaks off in a sentence in the middle, or there's some piece of text missing, but we see some scribbled margin note at a very different part of the manuscript, and that is actually linking to this text. And for us humans, when such things happen, we immediately have an intuitive idea of what could have happened, while LLMs actually have absolutely no model of the world. They cannot judge the distance between one building or the other. They have no idea of the physical reality of a piece of paper and so on. They just don't have that because they are text prediction machines. And of course, in recent years, we have seen the addition of these so-called multimodal capabilities, like Gemini getting really good at OCR, for example, of Tibetan and Sanskrit material. So these capabilities are being added to the model, but even though they can do something with visual data, it doesn't mean that they suddenly have a model of the underlying world. And that is a very, very big limitation, which is just fundamentally cannot be overcome easily. So when it comes to really reasoning into those kind of problems, LLMs are just the wrong tool in my eyes. They can be helpful to turn a piece of image into a text, or to give some possible variant readings on a passage, but they will never be able to really reason reliably into those problems. So what does all of this mean for philology then? I think on the one hand, there's just the reality that humans cannot compete with LLMs when it comes to what they have read and seen. That's just technically not possible. LLMs, just by their very design, and this really is a basic principle of how they work, they will continue to provide answers regardless of whether this is factual or not. And this is really about integrating databases and external resources to contain this problem. So it becomes less something that people working with these tools are less confronted with. And then LLMs are by design optimized to provide the most probable solution given a limited set of information. And here I want to make the point that this is actually at odds with the principle of lectio difficilio, which means in philology that usually if you have variant readings, then it's not always the most obvious, the most smooth and easy reading of a manuscript that you would want to follow. But in many cases, it's actually the less intuitive, the more complex reading, which could be the better one, because humans, when they are confronted with difficulties, have the tendency to go for the more easy and straightforward solution, which also means that if a text is being transmitted, those more obvious solutions are the more likely to survive in certain cases. And I think LLMs work very, very similar by their architecture. So if we think about exciting philological problems, these usually require solutions that lie totally outside of these mechanisms that LLMs can provide. And I think this is just, if people think, okay, maybe if the progress of these tools will continue like that for the next 20 years or 50 years, then maybe there will be no philology anymore. I don't think so. I really don't think so, because we have a basic fundamental disagreement of how statistical models are trained and how the really interesting questions in philology need to be engaged with. However, that being said, I think it's very important to note that humans when confronting with editing text, we frequently struggle to even arrive at reasonable solutions. And that I include myself in this. In a lot of cases, I'm even, we read a manuscript, we have to decide, is this a ma or a sa in the case of Sanskrit? And these are, in many cases, not highly interesting philological questions, and the solution is obvious most of the time. And when it comes to that, LLMs can be extremely helpful to make the work of the philologist easier, because choosing between ma and sa can be trivial, and this can be automatized. And this also means that the work on editing text can become less tiring, less time consuming. And in that sense, especially if we combine LLMs with external databases, they will become, and they might already be, invaluable support tools when it comes to the philological work. So they can provide relevant context. For example, please look at this related passage here. It has a very similar wording to the one you are working on. So that's something like Meter Search and also the Deep Research Translation System are offering, to really give just wider context, because the person working on the text might not have read enough material to really be competent on that end. And then, of course, LLMs can provide translation suggestions, which in many cases can help the people working on the text to get different insights on how a translation might work here. And that can then also lead to other decisions on how to create the edition of the text. And this is something, feedback that we got on Dharmamitra very frequently, is the translation of Dharmamitra is not always good, it's not always better, but it's a different opinion on a problem, and it enables to think a little bit out of the box when working on a difficult passage. So in that way, I think these translation suggestions, even though they might not be reliable, they can be faulty, they can still be of some use if the person working with the tool is able to judge the quality, of course. And then we might also enter a phase where these models will be able to suggest textual improvements directly. So right now we don't offer that at Dharmamitra. I think you can, of course, use Claude and ChatGPT to ask for emendations and improvements on a given text. I think judging the quality right now, I'm a bit cautious. I don't think that is convincing at the moment, but we might get there in a couple of years, that we have at least basic suggestions. And here again, I think the really difficult questions will remain difficult and outside of the scope of these LLMs. But I think for more easy and more obvious problems, we might see them being helpful at some point. Okay, I think at this point, I would like to move on to the section on Dharmamitra and Dharma Nexus, and what we are actually providing to make the work of translators and of researchers easier here. So what is Dharmamitra actually? So this is a research project that is co-hosted by the Zara Foundation, by Tohoku University, and the Berkeley AI Research Lab. And it was started at UC Berkeley between Professor Kurt Keutzer and me in April 2023. And we are focusing on integrating advanced data-driven methods into the daily workflow of translators and researchers who are engaged with textual material of the Buddhist tradition. And currently, Dharmamitra provides machine translation, grammatical analysis, and search, and as OCR as well for Tibetan, Sanskrit, Pali, and Chinese. And Dharmamitra also features the Dharma Nexus database, which is the underlying textual reference database of the project. At this point, I would like to introduce the Meter search system briefly. So you can set the search tab, and you can search basically with phrases in English and Sanskrit, Pali, Tibetan directly. So here I'm giving an example in English. And you can see how the system is able to find references in Tibetan and Sanskrit. And if you are interested in a specific passage, you can then click on that explanation button, and it will give you a translation of the passage, as well as an introduction into the context and how that relates to the query. And also it will provide references from the Dharma Nexus database, like other parallels to this passage. This could be in the same language, but in this case, We also see parallels in Dharma Nexus in Sanskrit and in Chinese for a query that was given in Tibetan. So Mitra search provides what we might call traditional search, and this is for Sanskrit, of course, not trivial, as many of you on this call know that Sanskrit is written in this continuous Sandhit version where the words are morphed together based on their phonology, and we also have compounding, which means there can be very, very long compound words, and all of this is very challenging when we want to create a searchable database. And Mitra on that end uses the grammatical preprocessing we have to turn these queries into segmented words, and then we enable the search on this. And this was something we already did at Buddha Nexus before. And yeah, so that is the traditional search layer. And of course, we also do that for Chinese and for Tibetan and Pali. And then we have the semantic search system, which enables to find passages that are similar in meaning but use different wording. So, and this is really the purpose of Mitra search in the first place, is to find passages that are related to a given query. It's not built to be a general question and answer system. So if you go to Mitra search and you ask, when did Vasubandhu live? It will not give you an answer because it's not built to do that kind of thing. It's built to find related passage to a given query passage. So it's really very useful if you paste, for example, a Sanskrit passage and you want to find out what Tibetan references might exist that have a similar idea. So in that way, it's really about similarity in the meaning of the whole phrase. And on that end, we also offer the multilingual semantic search. So we provide the ability to find Tibetan passage based on a search query in Sanskrit or in Chinese, for example. And then lastly, Mitra search also enables to trace concepts, ideas, and general questions to some extent. So if you ask a question like, when did Vasubandhu live? And we have a Sanskrit text that discusses this, which to my knowledge doesn't really exist, we might be able to at least locate that passage. So it's possible to find passages and references based on input queries that are semantically related. And on that end, yeah, Mitra search is of course also sometimes finding results that are not entirely related because it's a semantic search engine and it's not really good at judging how relevant a result is to a given query. So that's one of the limitations of the system, and you might encounter that if you work with it, that it's not always, the results are not always 100% relevant, but usually the relevant results are among the top results. Just to very quickly explain the interface. So you have the input box here where you can input something in English, Sanskrit, Tibetan, or other languages, and then you can set the filter options, which is actually very important. You can limit your results to only include Chinese or only include Tibetan. And then you get the search result, and we always show the original text first, and that's the big difference to ChatGPT and other tools who start to immediately provide you with a response. And we are always linking the response to a given result in a primary language. So we will show the result from our database first, and then you have the explanation button, which gives you additional translation and contextual explanations of the result. And then, of course, we have the link into Dharma Nexus, so you can click here on this link, and this will then take you to the textual reference database. So that is for the search part. Now moving on to the Mitra translation part. So on the one hand, we have translation into English and other languages. This should by now be well known, and there's not too much to say about this, but we have added recently the research mode. So you set the target language to English research, and then you can paste a passage like this, Sanskrit verses from the Trimshika Kardika, and then you can see how the deep research translation mode will provide an English translation. It will then also give an introduction of the context of this piece of text. It will give the actual references into the Dharma Nexus database where the original Sanskrit passage is coming from, and then it will give the Sanskrit commentaries, in this case the Trimshika Bhashya. It will give relevant Tibetan parallels, including the Trimshika Tika in this case, and it also gives Chinese parallels if they are relevant. So here this would of course be the Cheng Wei Shalun, which has been including and discussing these verses. And then we also include secondary literature excerpts of that if they are relevant to the query. So this in a way is a summary, a demonstration of the deep research capabilities of our translation system. So to summarize this, Mitra Deep Research combines the strengths of Mitra Search, what I have demonstrated before, and the Mitra machine translation system into one unified experience. It provides machine translation, gives contextual explanations, and also possible relevant passages from the Dharma Nexus database. And it provides the deep links into Dharma Nexus, so the users can actually read the source text themselves and verify the validity of the generated output. So of course, the answer by deep research might still contain hallucinations and faulty conclusions. That still happens. It's a limitation of the technology, but we try to provide the users with links to the actual primary sources wherever possible, so they can verify themselves how reliable the answer is. Since I get the question asked from time to time how this Mitra translation and deep research actually works, to just give a very brief overview. So we start with an input query, in this case, the Sanskrit Atmadharmo Pacharohi Vividoya Pravartate, which we already used in previous examples. Then we first use a so-called neural embedding system, which basically turns this sentence into a numerical representation, so a high-dimensional vector, this is called. And then with this vector, we can search across the Dharma Nexus database for related passages that express similar meaning. So then we query the Pali, the Tibetan, the Sanskrit, the Chinese index, including the secondary literature, in order to find all relevant references. And then we create the response where we use Gemini API. So we use Gemini Flash, since we also have a research grant by Google to support this kind of work. And that then generates a it's a lightweight LLM that will summarize all of these results and provide them to the user. While the actual heavy lifting of the Dharmamitra system is done by the way it queries and prioritizes these results. So that's the technical part here. Coming to the last part of this presentation, the Dharma Nexus database. So this is a textual reference database which enables to explore intertextuality between texts. In this screenshot, I'm showing the Abhidharma Kosha Bhashya by Vasubandhu as the example. And in the middle column, you can see the Tibetan translation as well as the Chinese translation by Paramata. And on the right hand, you can see the translation by Paramata opened at the moment. So it displays the matching Chinese passage to the selected sentence in Sanskrit on the left-hand side. And this is, of course, in the way it works, quite similar to Buddha Nexus, which has introduced this functionality a couple of years ago. So Dharma Nexus is an intertextuality exploration database. It is based on the foundational work of Buddha Nexus, but it has since then seen significant improvement in the algorithms. The interface is improved, and it also has multilingual parallels and strong integration into the other Mitra tools. It has monolingual intertextual links for Sanskrit, Pali, Tibetan, and Chinese, so this is known from Buddha Nexus, but it also has the multilingual sentence level parallels between Sanskrit and Tibetan, Sanskrit and Chinese and Tibetan. And this is more than 2 million sentence pairs at the moment. And yeah, it's the main textual reference database of Dharmamitra. So to summarize, what is the kind of workflow that these tools now enable for people who translate Buddhist material, but also who work on philological problems? So on the one hand, Mitra Translate is there to give a quick draft rendering, an overview of the content of a passage in modern language. And even people who studied for decades, who are very, very good at reading all of these languages, they still give us the feedback that being able to quickly render a section of text into English is immensely helpful to understand whether this is relevant to a specific problem. And yeah, I think we struggle with material that lies outside of our own research domain. At least I can say that for myself. If I'm confronted with some non-Buddhist Sanskrit material, I always struggle for a while to understand the context, the specific nuances of the meaning and so on. And Mitra translation here can be very, very helpful to get a quick idea of, is this passage actually relevant to my problem or not? And then, of course, each of the sentences might still not be translated well enough to use directly. And we are very aware that basically everything that Mitra Translate produces in the workflow of a translator still needs to be improved, still needs to be changed before it can be used or included in a translation. Yeah. So in that end, yeah, we understand this much more as providing draft renderings that can be used for further workflows. And then we have the deep research tool, which gives an overview of the intertextuality, provides links into Dharma Nexus, and locates the passage in the wider map of Buddhist literature. Then we have the Dharma Nexus database, which enables to pin down the context and the deeper intertextuality of specific results. So that's where the users then really can dive deeply into the network of intertextuality of all of this material. And then we have Mitra Search, which enables the more targeted exploration of specific passages, ideas, and concepts. And here we have the filter options where people can then really narrow down the queries to only a certain section of the Pali Canon or the Sanskrit literature to be really, really specific in what they are looking for. So in that way, we provide a workflow that goes full circle, starting from the draft translation all the way to specific search queries about specific concepts and ideas. So coming to the community perception, so where does Dharmamitra stand at the moment? We have between 1,600 and 1,900 daily unique visitors, between 350 and 400 people who use our translation system and send more than one query a day. So these are unique people who come every day to the website and translate more than one sentence. And then we see a very, very strong growth of the use of Mitra Search and deep research. And by now they are constituting about 30% of our daily traffic. We also get a steady flow of positive feedback from all over the Buddhist Studies community. So of course we also get negative feedback at times, that happens, but I think the ratio is more like 80 to 90% positive, and then of course some critiques. Usually these are more technical points about certain texts that are missing in the database or some specific renderings that didn't go well, and of course that's always the case with a project like this. There are always things that need improvement, and any kind of feedback we can get is extremely helpful for us because it gives us the opportunity to improve the system, and we are very, very happy for everything that we hear back from our users. So what is the roadmap for Dharmamitra in the near future? So when it comes to the data sets, we will certainly expand our Tibetan data further with the help of the Tsara Foundation at this point. So the Rinchen Terze is very high on our list of priorities, and we have already been starting to prepare the material, and it will be included in the coming months. I'm very confident. Also, the further Nyingma material offered by the Tsara Foundation will be included in our Dharma Nexus and the Mitra Search system. And also we have a strategic data partnership with the BDRC, which we are collaborating very closely with, also on OCR technology and on expanding the data sets that we can make available on our tools. For Sanskrit, we are continuously adding new e-texts, and we are planning to have like scheduled updates on our website, hopefully every quarter, where we include new Sanskrit material. And here we are also collaborating with other projects and institutions, and we want to actively encourage people who work on Sanskrit material, if they have interest to include that in the Dharmamitra system, then please reach out to us. I'm very, very happy to add anything that makes sense at this point. When it comes to Chinese, of course, non-Buddhist pre-modern texts like the Kanripo collection is extremely interesting for us, and I have already been communicating a bit with Christian Wittern on this, and we are certainly happy to include that at some point. And of course, Japanese material, both classical, but also eventually at some point modern research literature as well, would be extremely valuable, and that is certainly something we are also trying to integrate. Then Dharmamitra has a research track on developing OCR models for Sanskrit and Tibetan, and we hope to make that available. We already have an OCR functionality on our website at the moment, and we hope to be able to provide our specific own trained model at some point in the future. So right now the OCR system uses Gemini API, but we hope to give our own specifically trained model at some point in the future. And in general, we will do incremental updates on the functionality, the interface, and so on. But as I already mentioned previously in my overview of the overall AI landscape and technology at the moment, I think it's safe to say that also for Mitra, we have reached a certain plateau where making big jumps in quality is not that possible anymore, which I think is also a good thing, because it means we can now focus on adding more data, which is the most important thing, is to increase the coverage of Tibetan, Sanskrit, Chinese, Japanese, and Pali material that we include, and to increase the reliability of the search system and the other systems more in smaller steps. So we are not looking at big new releases that will change the way you use Dharmamitra in your daily work, but we are more looking at improvements in quality one step at a time for now. Lastly, I would like to express our big gratitude on the one hand to the Tzada Foundation that is making the daily operations for Dharmamitra possible and that is supporting us in very significant ways. Then Fokuang AI has been also supporting us very significantly, and we are collaborating on the establishment of the Fokuang AI system, which will provide Dharmamitra-based machine translation for the Fokuang translation projects. And then, of course, to Kurt Kreutzer, his great students and the postdocs at the Berkeley AI Research Lab that have been facilitating, supporting, and encouraging the development of Dharmamitra over the last 2.5 years. So yeah, thank you a lot for that as well. Yeah, I think at this point, that's all for my talk. Thank you very much. And yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Nehrdich. This was extremely informative, and I myself feel like I understand a bit more of how these models work. Thank you. Now we will accept questions from the audience that will send questions through the chat. We already have a couple of questions, and however, I would like to start myself to ask one question based on what you mentioned about hallucinations and how you explained the example that you used, suggested to me that these models are not, they don't do very well with ambivalence in a way.
Yes.
So that I just wondered whether that is a question of the very structure, or it is a question of guidelines that a specific model is being offered. And I'm asking this because when I think of Sanskrit, I think of a language where ambivalence, in fact, is greatly valued. So it's not necessarily always geared towards disambiguation as, I don't know, modern academic English would be. So in that case, I wonder whether this is a structural feature or it is something that is rather part of the guidelines that could be modified?
Yeah. So I think this is a very important observation, and I fully agree that for a language like Sanskrit, ambivalence and being able to read the same verse, the same sentence in different ways is a core feature. Yeah? It's something that is really deeply ingrained in the language, while the way machine translation systems and LLMs are trained, and also the way they are tested. And this is really, I think, the whole structure of the field that does this kind of research is just coming from an extremely different approach. So they are really, when they test the quality of GPT-4 or of Gemini, they are looking at, is the model able to multiply 55 by 225? And if the outcome of that is correct, then the model is better. If the outcome of that is wrong, then the model is wrong. But this framework requires a right and a wrong answer and nothing else. And if we think about translation in our field, of course, and even just understanding of the text, that just doesn't work, yeah, because a valid understanding of a passage can have multiple possible solutions. And in that sense, I think the whole way these models are fine-tuned, and this is, I think, also important to differentiate. So on the one hand, we have the so-called pre-training, where we just expose the model to a large body of text, and the model then learns general capabilities. And in this stage, ambiguity in data is very commonly seen. As I mentioned, we have a lot of cases, of course, where different solutions to the same problem are valid. And while we pre-train these models structurally, these ambiguities are still preserved. But then the so-called fine-tuning stage comes, where we take specific tasks and then we train the model to do, for example, machine translation from language A to language B. And I have been in touch, I was invited to Johns Hopkins University last year, which is the leading university on machine translation technology. So they have developed the Google Translate, or the students of Johns Hopkins have been developing the Google Translate system, which is the most commonly used machine translation system, I think, to date. And on that occasion, it just occurred to me when I talked with some of the really great researchers, and these are brilliant people, absolutely brilliant people, that they don't really often think of translation as a problem where you have multiple possible answers to a given query. I think they are much more coming from, okay, we have a manual of TV and we want to translate that from Chinese into English, and you don't really think about ambiguity and the depth of the language in that context. And the whole benchmarking system on machine translation is not really accounting for that. And I think it's really about time to see what we can do to change the structure on how we evaluate these models. That's really the big problem. Is like, how can we even judge the quality when we have an ambiguous answer where 5 or 6 different options are right? Like, what would be a good framework to do that? And currently that would then again require to have experts to look at the output and give a rating. And that is, of course, very, very difficult to do in practice, because people who are able to do that are very few in the world, and they have certainly maybe better things to do than to look at the output of these models all the time. So yeah, I think there's a structural issue here, which I don't think is like technically impossible to overcome, but it would require a big change in mentality and an approach to the evaluation of these systems within computer science and within AI research. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now I will read one of the questions from the audience. Curious on how do we incorporate Buddhist ethics into AI? How do we train our models based on ethics so that AI do not hallucinate and throw unwanted answers? Thanks. I think you partly answered, but I think this question just adds this spin of ethical considerations.
Yeah. Again, this is a very, very important question. And I think when it comes to Dharmamitra, of course, we are focusing on textual applications, translation and rendering faithfully the original source languages into English, and then providing references to other texts and so on. And in that sense, Dharmamitra is at the moment not doing any ethical judgment of output and so on, because I don't think we are in the same category like, for example, ChatGPT, where you can ask a question like, during my meditation, I have experienced this, I'm experiencing that. Is this actually in accordance with the Dharma and so on? These kind of questions are, I think, extremely challenging, and I would like to intentionally avoid Dharmamitra to even go in that direction. I think that is just something which I think there are other teams working on that, and I'm also very, very excited about developments in that direction. So Dharmamitra itself as a project really focuses on making text available to translators and researchers more efficiently, so that they can then do this kind of work. And on that end, I would say the responsibility of using a system like Dharmamitra in the daily work, and there's of course ethics involved in that. I'm very sure about translators who work there, and I think on that end I would say there's still a certain responsibility on the side of the user. So I would, for example, not encourage people who use Dharmamitra to just paste the output on the internet. I think there's an ethical problem with that, which I'm very, very aware of. So if somebody just drops a line of Tibetan into Dharmamitra and then cuts and pastes that into Facebook or Twitter or something, I see a big ethical problem with that. And on that end, I think the users have a certain responsibility. And certainly for things like ChatGPT and Gemini, I would be very happy to see more involvement of Buddhist ethics into the way these systems are trained and also made available. And I think this is a very, very challenging and important area. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, your explanation actually partly answered, I think, another question I myself have, which is, I noticed that on Dharmamitra, you avoided creating a single generalized discursive prompt, which in a way it would seem easier, like for many users, to just have a single prompt where they can ask and receive answers which pertain to all the areas that are offered in Dharmamitra. On the other hand, I realized that if that prompt were to be offered, then they could ask questions which have nothing to do with the restrictions of topics that you have on Dharmamitra. So is that one of the reasons why you don't have such a prompt?
Exactly. That's why we have a more rigid and contained interface, like you can do translation. And I think the layout of the interface is, of course, it's inspired by Google Translate and DeepL and so on. There's a certain way on how translation websites are built. And we are very intentionally following that, because we don't want to create the impression that Dharmamitra can be used to answer questions like, how do I handle certain challenges in my meditation, for example. I think this is really nothing that we can even work on. And I would even make the point that technology like Dharmamitra could actually be a bit dangerous on that end, because we are really then providing some reference into the Mahavibhasha, and this might give the user some distorted ideas, because we are not really able, and that's another big problem that we also encounter with Mitra search, is how to actually answer these questions. If we think about a general prompt where you can ask anything, and then our search result is actually favoring a certain Huayan commentary because it just has a very clear expression of that topic at hand, but the user might be expecting an answer from the Pali Canon or from certain Sanskrit sutras instead, because we might have an intuition that we want to get results from the Pali Canon or the sutras first, or maybe not, depending on our own education and background. We might have very different expectations towards such a system. And this is already a challenge in the Mitra search system, where we get feedback and people say, well, the results are useful, but I would expect the Pali Canon to be first. And then my answer to that is that, but yeah, that's one opinion, and I can totally respect that. But should we make a decision to always prioritize the Pali Canon in a system like this? I think that's on its own already a certain decision that might other people feel uncomfortable with. And this is certainly the reason why we are not doing a general prompt, because then we would actually have to face all of these questions all of the time. And I think really we are not in a position to offer that.
Thank you. Another question from the audience. In your opinion, what work is needed to improve the AI explainability?
Oh, that's also a good point. I think so the approach we are doing at the moment is to make our data sources more transparently visible to the users by the deep research translation system, for example, which gives the references and the context, which I think improves already for the users to understand how Dharmamitra arrives at certain solutions. So that's certainly one way. And I think I would also say there's a general critique that one can certainly make towards ChatGPT and Claude and so on. And certainly Dharmamitra is not safe from that critique. And that is they are training on data and we don't know which data it is, and they are creating output and we don't know on what data the output is based. And I can also see all the grievances and the struggle that comes with that, because people have been translating and working on this material for many years, and suddenly they see their own output in these models, and that is not always a nice experience. And I think in that end, we are working on being more transparent with that by providing the actual data in the output and providing links and references. And I would hope that large language models by these big providers will also go that way. Yeah.
Now there's another question from the audience. I will ask it, but I think it's somewhat personal, so please feel free not to answer if you prefer. The question is, what is your Buddhist practice and how do you integrate that circumstance in your work?
Yeah, that's it's a nice question. I think I rarely get asked that in this context. But I mean, just as a general answer to that, I have been following the Vipassana tradition for many years, even though I'm not actively going to retreats in recent years, but I'm still doing my practice every day for at least 1 hour, maybe 2 or 3 if the time permits that. And while I mean, it's probably not influencing Dharmamitra directly. I don't think so, but at least I hope that it helps a bit to stay on track when it comes to the goals of the project, in the sense of, for example, that we are not commercializing Dharmamitra. And I was always impressed by the fact that Vipassana is really able to do this all on donations. And I think that's also one idea that influenced Dharmamitra in a way, that we are not having a subscription-based model, and I also hope that we will not need to do that in the future. So far, of course, the Tata Foundation here has been really fantastic support at this point, and there's really a deep service to the public by making something like this available without requiring users to sign up and to create accounts and then to transfer personal data and so on. I think there's really a big advantage in being able to do this. Yeah.
Thank you. I have a question regarding training for translation. And this question has to do with something we have discussed in the past, which is using cases. So let's say, just please accept this premise as potentially valid, even if I cannot now support it at length. But let's say that there is a problem in the representation of the 7th Vibhakti in secondary literature, both in the way in which it is taught as having primarily a locative meaning, and thus it is translated as locative case, and I think the two things are connected in the way it has been translated as a location. And I think that this actually has caused numerous mistranslations in the history of Buddhist studies in English and possibly in other languages. And one of the most well-known mistranslations, from my perspective at least, is a mistranslation, is that of the very first verse of the Trimshika, where we have Vijnana Parinami.
Yeah.
And it has been translated quite often as if it occurs within the transformation of consciousness, which I think is clearly a mistranslation.
Yeah.
And I'm asking this because that's exactly what I read earlier when you showed the example. And I was wondering whether you also feel that there is something about the representation of Sanskrit grammar in available translated texts and also didactic materials, which could be addressed to improve the quality of the Dharmamitra translations.
Yeah. Yeah, this is on the one hand a very specific example, but I'm also very happy that you give that because it makes it very tangible on what our concrete day-to-day challenges of this tool is. And I think on the one hand, the whole grammatical abilities of Dharmamitra are largely based on the digital Sanskrit Sanskrit canon by Oliver Helwig, who he led for many years, and it's basically one of the great resources for computational linguistics in Sanskrit studies. And I think there are, of course, limitations to data sets like this. And this again goes back to what we touched on before about ambiguity and about the possibility to render grammar. And I think that problem, of course, also comes down to breaking up compounds and the case endings and so on. This can, in certain cases, be interpreted in different ways, and you can have different possible solutions. And I think there's a fundamental challenge of displaying this in a reasonable way in systems like universal dependency tree banks and so on. So I don't want to go into too much detail, but I think on that end, we hit a certain wall of how this kind of data can be annotated. But the good news is that it's especially projects like Dharmamitra that can help to improve this situation, I think. Because if we think of ChatGPT, you cannot really, send Sam Altman an email and say, can you please improve the locative representation? I see there's a problem here. Very likely nobody at OpenAI will even take note of that email. While in the case of Dharmamitra, of course, if I can actually do something about it, it's a very different question that might take time, but we can at least gather that feedback and see if we can make improvements to the tree bank, for example, the Sanskrit database, and then incrementally work on these problems. And also as we get more reliable translations, better translations, we can also include them in the system and in that way improve it. So I think Dharmamitra can be a community resource for Buddhist studies in that regard, that we have at least one system we can work on to improve, while we don't really can control how Gemini or ChatGPT handle these problems. Yeah.
Thank you. And on the note of community, here's another question from the audience.
Yeah.
Does Mitra work with other Buddhist organizations other than the partners mentioned today? And is it interested in building partnerships?
Yeah, so we are, of course, very interested in building partnerships. So on the one hand, we have the Tzada Foundation, as I mentioned, is very, very vital in our support. Then we have Foguang AI, which is also a very, very important partner, more than 1 year by now. And we are, of course, in close contact with BDRC. And then we have a number of other projects like 84,000, for example, where we're also talking with them. And certainly RKTS, for example, other resources, we are in discussion. And I think there's a general sense of friendly collaboration. And if there are other projects that want to reach out and work with us, then please, you are absolutely welcome. And we are very, very interested to work together. On that end, I think one note of that is important here is that I'm basically already at the limit of what I can handle time-wise. And even though I really want to support more collaborations, we also need to be a bit careful with how we approach that. So on the one hand, our door is absolutely open, but then on the other hand, on what we can do is also limited by the bandwidth of the project. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So they can write you an email, but a cautious one.
Yeah. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Then another question. This is a very specific question about how it works. Is it possible to input a Sanskrit compound and ask, is this English rendering permissible?
Yeah. I think right now with the way Dharmamitra works, this is not possible. So the users can, of course, use Dharmamitra to get a translation or also the grammatical breakdown, and then they can judge themselves if this is actually matching the English. But I think this touches at one interesting use case, which I think also other people requested this in the past, that is like using Dharmamitra as a sort of quality control where you can input your own rendering and then it gives you some ideas. Is this actually a good rendering or are there problems? And I think that might also go a bit in the direction of using a tool like Dharmamitra in education, yeah, where you can maybe work with students together to say, okay, maybe you don't use Dharmamitra while you translate, but you can then input your translation into the system later and it will give you some hints at where it goes wrong. So I see a possibility to do that, and it would be really interesting, yeah. But yeah, for now, it's not yet possible, yeah.
There's another question from the audience. I will read it as it is. It's not clear to me exactly, but I'll just read it. Maybe you will understand it better than I do.
Yeah.
Let me question about data traffic. Do you have confidence to reduce the 30% current traffic on daily search, 1,600, 1,900? If search is more than million, and how could you solve? Could you share a brief technique or general solution? I'm not, do you understand exactly what, it's something technical I cannot understand exactly.
I mean, I can just generally say about the search system that I think our system is actually quite able to handle search requests. We are a bit more bottlenecked on OCR. That is a bit of our problem at the moment. So while translation and searches, I think even if we had 10 times more users, I think the system would still be very stable. There's no reason to suspect that things will go sideways. But for OCR, we are a bit more under pressure because sometimes, I mean, we are very happy we can provide OCR services, but if people upload lots of large books in short succession, then it can become a bottleneck and maybe the rendering can take a lot of time. So in that sense, when it comes to like generally speaking about what our bandwidth and our capabilities are, I think the OCR part really needs to to be treated a bit more with care, while the other systems are, I think, there's no issue with the traffic we are getting. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So just more or less to conclude, I would like to summarize an impression I got overall from your talk and your answers. So there's people who seem to genuinely have the impression that AI, and perhaps that is also a function of this choice of terminology, is going to be able to simply replace humans as editors, translators, and researchers, because it's a form of intelligence with practically unlimited potential for growth, which is not the case for humans, and therefore it will be able to do everything. But from the way you have presented today the actual applications, it sounds more like it's a helpful complement, and it's not exactly the same as what a human can do. And this is not just a matter of how to put it, a temporary problem that needs a fix, but there's something structural about it that makes it more of a complement and a tool rather than just something that will eventually substitute human engagement with this. Did I understand your overall perspective correctly?
Yes, I think that's a very good summary. I think these AI tools, these large language models, are just really good at simulating how language works. And in that way, I think for people who are working with language primarily, and this is translators, philologists, and researchers on textual material in our field, this has strong implications because they can be incredibly useful to understand what is possible in a certain way, yeah, and these tools will be incredibly useful for that. But yeah, I think the final decision needs to be made by a human on how to use this simulator in the actual work. And I don't think there's any way to get around that. And I think it would be a big misunderstanding of the technology if we assume that philology is done in 20 years. I think it will certainly change. And I think on the other hand, I would also say it could be a bit short-sighted to say we don't need this technology and we will only continue to work the way we did it 10 years ago. I think that is equally, I think, a rather dangerous position. Yeah.
But so just to connect this to a famous philosopher that just recently passed away. So that means that your understanding of AI to some extent supports Searle's example of the Chinese room.
Yeah, that might be. I mean, I would need to recall in detail, but yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
We can discuss it later.
Yes,
But
yes,
it's a famous example which is used to highlight how there's something rather different in terms of how the human mind works and how computational tools work. So I will share it with you later and ask
Yes,
your
please.
thoughts on it. Well,
Yes.
thank you very much. I think we have reached our usual time limit. We're really grateful to you, Professor Nehrdich, for this extremely useful presentation and also for the ensuing discussion, which for me personally was very, very helpful. So thank you. Thanks to everyone who has participated. Later you will be able to see the recording. And please also check the other recordings in the series and check our website for our future installments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I was
Thank
also
you.
very happy. Yeah.